A quick warning before we dive into this record. This album covers some incredibly heavy topics. So much so that I thought a genuine warning was actually necessary. Suicide, drug abuse, dehumanization, depression, it's all here. It's not a very positive record, but there's definitely a lot to learn and to connect to here. If you're alright with that, let's dive right in. The Downward Spiral is widely considered one of the greatest rock albums ever recorded, and for very good reason. This album is a semi-autobiographical concept album about the life of lead singer and writer Trent Reznor. It tackles the tragic story of his descent, or his downward spiral, into madness. Today, I have prepared for you an analysis of the lyricism packed into this record. Without further ado, let's get started. Track 1, Mr. Self-Destruct. If this is your first time listening to this record, this song will likely feel abrupt and a little noisy. At least that's how I felt. Once you experience all this album has to offer, this song in context is fantastic. The song begins with a loud banging sound, which is actually a sample from a George Lucas film called THX 1138. In this clip, a man is, quote, viciously beaten by a prison guard. The sound of the beating speeds up and reaches its peak when it is abruptly cut off and enters our protagonist. Not necessarily our hero, but the man we follow for a majority of this record. We hear his internal monologue here, and truly the very beginning of his downward spiral. It beautifully illustrates the battle ensuing in his head. His thoughts, his love, his lust, and most notably, his hatred. His hatred for his own lack of control. His inability to navigate himself out of this downward spiral. The chorus begins as the protagonist personifies these bad characteristics he has and appropriately names them Mr. Self-Destruct. He believes this Mr. Self-Destruct to be a constant in not just his own life, but in the lives of everyone. He believes there's a part of all of us that is constantly trying to tear ourselves down. The next verse begins as he attacks the topic of faith. He finds religion to be a farce and believes them to have impure intentions. He won't turn to God to face this battle. The chorus is repeated and then an interlude begins, where very, very subtly we can hear the phrase, "You let me do this to you. I am an exit." Here, I believe he addresses the listener, as he believes we all have a Mr. Self-Destruct within us. He tells us that our efforts to cover him up are meaningless. He controls us down to our very core. This internal battle with his darker self is present throughout the entire album, so keep that in mind. The bridge begins as we are made aware of the character's substance issues, the high he can no longer sustain, the need within him for more, which he again attributes to Mr. Self-Destruct. The final verse begins as the relationship between the two becomes a bit more clear. Mr. Self-Destruct is instant gratification, through whatever means he comes up with. All of his darkest emotions and his desires personified. The song concludes with a guitar outro. If you're using your listening ears here, you can just barely hear a robotic voice repeating the phrase, "Here I am." With the conclusion of this track, Mr. Self-Destruct is now inside of our protagonist's head. The darkness within him has been let loose. Here he is. Track 2, Piggy. The second track on the album provides a bit more context on how our protagonist kind of found himself in this situation, as well as provides a bit more dialogue between our two characters. In this song, we learn that the root cause of this downward spiral was a bad breakup. The song seems to be Mr. Self-Destruct berating our protagonist over his failed relationship. All of his fears had come true, and he had lost the woman he loved. This is the first of several songs on this record to use the phrase, "Nothing can stop me now." On this track, I wouldn't necessarily use the word optimistic. To describe it, perhaps denial is the best way to describe it. Nothing can stop him now, because he doesn't care anymore. Trent actually explained this line in an interview. He said, "I'm saying, if I don't care, you can't affect me." Through disassociation, he attempts to battle back against his darker self. The only other notable line I found in this track is in the second verse when he says, "What am I supposed to do? I lost my shit because of you." now placing the blame on his old lover, completely shifting the blame away from himself in order to completely disassociate from the problem. Quick fun fact, if there's a single fun thing about this record, there's a cut line that you can still find in the booklet for the album that concludes this track with the line, "You don't need me anymore." Perhaps a message from Mr. Self-Destruct, realizing that the narrator is plenty able to take care of his own self-destruction. Yeah, that wasn't a very fun fact, I'm sorry. Track 3, Heresy. Heresy is a great track, but it puts the narrative story on the back burner. This song touches on the protagonist's attempted solution to his downward spiral, religion. The song begins with the protagonist concluding that religion is a farce, finding Christianity to merely be a dream, and finding the whole situation meaningless. The chorus begins with the phrase, "God is dead, and no one cares." The protagonist's demise has made him lose faith in God, and along with it, his purpose for living. He was angry at God. Why would God do this to him? He looked to God for comfort in his darkest time and was met with cold hard silence. He goes on to say, "If there is a hell, I'll see you there." A direct message to the Christian leaders he expects to see in hell for their corruption and their lies. The bridge begins when the protagonist seems to address the listener again. Will you die for this? Perhaps a plea for people to think for themselves and follow their own path, their dreams, and turning away from our programming. The song concludes with yet another unsung lyric from the Downward Spiral booklet. "Burning with your God in humility. Will you die for this?" This time, just a repeated phrase from the bridge, but I thought I should mention it. Track 4, March of the Pigs. Another track that is rather disconnected from the narrative, but kind of provides us with a deeper view into our character's psyche. The last track covered religion. This track covers consumerist culture. He sees them as nothing more than pigs waiting to be fed slop. The song begins with the protagonist antagonizing the consumers, inviting them to come gather up all the slop and horse it down. The pre-chorus begins with the perspective of the consumers themselves. People want a piece of everything. They just want to feel that connection with others and will stop at nothing to do it. The chorus begins as the narrator metaphorically lines the pigs up. He gives them their slop and then he peels off their mask. He pries that insatiable urge for more right off of them and asks them a simple question. Now, doesn't it make you feel better? It's clear that his resentment isn't towards the pig themselves. After all, how could it be? They're just doing as they were taught. The perspective then seems to change over to Mr. Self-Destruct, where he desires to destroy the society and everything that encourages the pigs to act the way they do. He wants to watch it all come down. The song concludes with the narrator's tragic realization. The pigs are the winners. In a sense, ignorance is bliss. Consumption is all they have ever known, and because there is no alternative in their mind, this is as good as it gets. He reassures the pigs that nothing will ever change. His dream of returning the pigs into people was nothing more than a fantasy. For the pigs, everything would be alright. Track 5, Closer. Closer is a song that is often misinterpreted by people, but that's not really surprising. The chorus sounds hypersexual, but the song has been stated to be about self-hatred and obsession. Trent said this when he was asked about the track. "It's super negative and super hateful. It's, I am a piece of shit and I am declaring that. And if you think you want me, here I am." I didn't think it would become a frat party anthem or a titty dancer anthem. Sadly, we are on YouTube, so I can't really go too in depth with the lyricism, but it's a song about the protagonist's search for human connection in spite of his self-hatred. He attempts to give himself away, to get closer to someone in order to come to terms with himself, to get himself closer to God, but it just doesn't work. You can't really love someone until you're able to truly love yourself. Track 6, Ruiner. Ruiner is a song that Trent has stated as being the hardest song to write on the record. It's the first song on the record that introduces the idea of the ruiners, or the people in control of our society. The people guiding the pigs down their path, if you would. The song begins with our protagonist speaking directly to someone. I first thought that he was speaking to the ruiners themselves, asking them how they could morally guide people into such meaningless lives. But then I read another thought that I think makes a bit more sense. Here, he speaks directly to God. He asks him how he could allow so many good and pure-hearted people to suffer in such terrible ways. How could he rationalize the destruction of so many lives? The pre-chorus begins as the protagonist reinforces his hatred for the leaders of society. The chorus then begins as we return back to the perspective of Mr. Self-Destruct. When did he get so big and strong? When did this part of himself become so dominant within him? When did he lose himself? The second verse begins as we return our focus to the Ruiners. He believes the Ruiners are conspiring against society and wish for the average person's downfall, using people as pieces on a chessboard. The pre-chorus begins as he attacks the Ruiners. I think this next line is really poetic, so I'm just going to read it to you. Maybe it's a part of me you took to a place I hoped it would never go. Maybe that fucked me up much more than you'll ever know. He sees the Ruiner within himself. Separating himself from society and the Ruiners was all that kept him sane. With the realization that they are one and the same, that within him lies a Ruiner, our protagonist reaches his breaking point. The rest of this record is, in a sense, the downward spiral reaching its peak, the rapid mental decline of an already broken man. Again, our protagonist questions the prominence of his alter ego. When did Mr. Self-Destruct become such a large part of him? With the conclusion of the chorus, the protagonist accepts, or at the very least acknowledges, that the Ruiner and Mr. Self-Destruct are merely an extension of himself, a voice within him, and nothing more. He knows now that this misery is something he himself created, not a disease he was infected with. The song concludes with a repetition of the phrase, "You didn't hurt me. Nothing can stop me now." One last effort from our protagonist to stop the man in his head. An attempt to save himself, although an unsuccessful one. A phrase repeated in denial. Track 7, The Becoming. Probably the most haunting song on this record thus far. The song features screaming in the background throughout a lot of the track, which just really helps illustrate the headspace our protagonist is in right now. The song begins with the protagonist deciding to make a change. In an attempt to protect himself from any more pain, he becomes a machine. He turns away from the world and rejects it. The chorus begins as the protagonist refers to himself as completely new. No longer the person we once knew. That part of me isn't here anymore, he says. As the song progresses, he completely loses his ability to feel anything. Not just pain, but happiness. He had become completely numb. The next chorus begins as he describes himself now as a corpse. He feels with the removal of his emotions that he has accepted his own death. In removing his emotional processes, he leaves his body to rot. He finds himself distanced from everyone he once knew, unable to connect with people anymore. He finds himself regretting his decision, wanting to feel again, just to know he was still alive, but it was too late. No matter what he does, the machine had taken over. The man he once was is dead, rotting in the back of his brain. It's at this point the song completely changes. The screams can still be heard, but an acoustic guitar takes over, a complete tonal shift. Perhaps a change in a perspective to the dying piece of himself. He finds himself hiding not from the world, but from his own self. Hiding from the part of himself that wants to feel and embracing the machine. He finds the part of himself capable of emotions is fading away, slipping through the cracks of his mind. The song returns to the robust noise we have come to love with this record as he repeats the phrase, "It won't give up. It wants me dead. God damn this noise inside my head." The noise in his head being the scrap of himself, begging to be saved, begging the machine to give him another chance. Track 8, I Do Not Want This. Arguably the most profound song on this record, I think. The song begins with the narrator reflecting. He realizes that Mr. Self-Destruct is consuming him and that he's losing control over himself. He attempts to justify his own actions, his hatred, his drug abuse by pointing his finger at the world, blaming society for making him this way. the ruiners, if you were. He finds himself stuck, repeating the same old mistakes, unable to overcome his darker self. He addresses his other self, the part able to feel, and tries to reach out to him, but he's just too far away. He knows if he could just reach him, he might be able to escape. The chorus here is a battle directly between our protagonist and Mr. Self-Destruct. The protagonist attempting to deny him control, repeating, "I do not want this." The instrumentation then becomes harsh as Mr. Self-Destruct takes over. "Don't you tell me how I feel." Mr. Self-Destruct is now on the brink of control. The man we once knew, buried within his subconscious. We return to our protagonist, who speaks almost as though he's saying his farewells. Mr. Self-Destruct antagonizes him, ordering him to give him control. "Maybe I don't have a choice," the protagonist says. The two battle once more, with Mr. Self-Destruct seemingly gaining control. The song concludes with Mr. Self-Destruct repeating his desires. "I want to know everything. I want to be everywhere. I want to fuck everyone in the world. And finally, I want to do something that matters." He realizes that his life can't be saved, even if he knew everything, even if he were everywhere, even if he fucked everyone. None of it would matter. None of it is something that matters. It is here that our protagonist has gone completely mad and cemented his own journey in the downward spiral. Track 9, Big Man with a Gun. This song is pretty much just our now mad protagonist fucking shit up. He lets out his rage and his hatred by harming others. Trent had this to say about the track. "I'd written those lyrics pretty quickly and I didn't know if I was going to use them or not. To me, Downward Spiral builds to a certain degree of madness, then it changes. That would be the last stage of delirium. So the original point of Big Man with a Gun was madness, but it was also making fun of the whole misogynistic gangster rap bullshit. Lyrically, he does some terrible shit in this song, most of which I can't talk about on our beautiful and lovely YouTube.com, so I'm just gonna move on. You get the idea. Track 10, A Warm Place, an interlude of sorts, I suppose. The song only has one lyric, but it's irrationally hard to hear. So much so that I didn't even know there were words until I looked it up, but man am I glad I did. Before we tackle the lyric, however, I want to touch on the instrumentation a bit, which I don't often do, but it feels necessary here. The song almost feels completely out of place on this record, especially with where the protagonist is right now. It sounds optimistic and in a way perfectly ties this album together. It's a song where we can feel the protagonist kind of coming to terms with himself, with his life, with his darkness. Now, with all of that context, allow me to read to you the one lyric on this song, which, by the way, isn't even unanimously agreed on. Trent has never confirmed the lyric on this song, but here's what most people think it is. "The best thing about life is knowing that you put it together." It's a brief unearthing of our original protagonist before he returns to his dormant state within Mr. Self-Destruct. The best part about life is knowing that it's yours. You decide how to live your life. No one else gets to. An incredibly euphoric moment on this album as we approach the conclusion of the downward spiral. Track 11, Eraser. Back to reality, where Mr. Self-Destruct continues to run rampant. The song begins with our protagonist struggling one more time. He dreams of someone coming to save him, likely his ex-lover. As he dreams of his lover, he becomes progressively more angry as Mr. Self-Destruct begins to corrupt his thoughts. His desire is not to be saved, but to get revenge on the woman that made him this way, the woman that broke him. It's at this moment that the protagonist realizes something. He is Mr. Self-Destruct. It always was him. In a state of desperation, he feels the only way to stop the downward spiral is a more permanent solution than I can reference on YouTube. The only way he could think of to finally silence the madness within. To silence everything. Track 12, Reptile. Reptile is one of the harder to understand tracks on this record, I thought. It is on this track that we come to understand his relationship with his ex-lover. He finds himself to be a victim of her manipulation and wonders if he was the only one she had done this to. The chorus begins as he likens her to a disease, an infection, and finally admits that it wasn't all her fault, that he's broken, and attempts to come to terms with that. He comes to realize that they were both broken and that they both kind of broke each other. There was no one party at fault. Everything happening to him was of his own volition. He accepts that he is a part of the problem and feels himself falling, approaching rock bottom. But it is here that he realizes that the downward spiral has no end. It will continue to spiral down into an infinite void until the day he can't take it anymore. In the final chorus of the song, we can hear the protagonist struggling through a muffled voice as Mr. Self-Destruct rants one more time. He begs to be let go and screams out, but to no avail. Track 13, The Downward Spiral. Now for the darkest song I've ever heard, the title track, The Downward Spiral. The song begins with a perspective shift. I'm not really sure who's speaking anymore, but it couldn't be our protagonist. Our protagonist has taken his own life, and as our character begins to fade away, we hear who I think is Mr. Self-Destruct describing his demise. Yelling can be heard in the background, perhaps people reacting to the corpse of our protagonist, or perhaps our protagonist reacting to his own death. The outro begins as our perspective shifts for the last time back to our protagonist. The world around him becomes blue, perhaps stained with sadness and with melancholy. He feels himself spilling out of his own head as he passes away, free from his madness. Track 14, Hurt, the final track on the album and perhaps the most devastating song I've ever heard in my entire life. The instrumentation feels almost haunting here. It seems like we're listening to a ghost. We return to our protagonist for the final time, perhaps in the afterlife, or perhaps after an unsuccessful attempt on his own life. The song begins with the phrase, "I hurt myself today," an incredible callback to the track Ruiner, where he repeats, "You didn't hurt me." He's lost all power over himself, and in an attempt to regain that power, lost his own life. In this moment of reflection, he realizes that he did this to himself, and that there must have been another way, another path he could have followed, perhaps a more righteous path. The pre-chorus begins as he looks back. What has his life come to? He speaks to his sweetest friend, likely another piece of his shattered mind. He created this friend within himself, not out of necessity, but out of loneliness. The chorus begins as he realizes that he has nothing, a mere empire of dirt. The dirt perhaps being a symbol for nothingness, or perhaps a symbol of his lifestyle and how he viewed himself. He realizes that he let everyone down with his death, and that all he did was make the people that cared about him hurt. He realizes that he was never meant to be more than he was. He tried to make himself into some righteous person, into something he wasn't, thus causing his own downward spiral. It is through self-acceptance that depression can be beat. Full of broken thoughts, I cannot repair, he says. He's filled with thoughts he knows are completely irrational and unreasonable, yet they are out of his control and feel impossible to change. He believes everyone around him has changed, and that he alone has remained the same, unable to overcome his negative thoughts. The chorus is repeated, leading into the outro and the conclusion of the downward spiral. If I could start again, 1,000,000 miles away, I would keep myself. I would find a way. At the end of his life and on the other side of death, he wishes for another chance. Not at a different life, but a chance to relive his own. To save himself from himself. To keep those that cared about him from hurting. To separate himself from what caused his downward spiral and his death. But even through this struggle to escape, he would keep himself. He would remain true to the man he was, and he would never again throw his life away so rashly. the greatest ending to an album ever. And with that, we have completed our downward spiral analysis. I hope you got something from this video. I know I did. Perhaps a more uplifting album coming soon. I don't know if I have another one of these in me quite yet. I'm open to suggestions. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed. Peace.